Hi everyone, it's Pastor Justin. Thanks again for listening to these vlogs. This has been really fun for me to kind of experiment with this social media. If you have any suggestions or things you'd like to hear about, please let me know. You can either do that by messaging me or just putting them in the comments below. Today I want to share a lesson I learned from the best book I've read in the last 2 years. It's called That Day, Great and Terrible. Full disclosure, it's written by a friend of mine, so I might be a little bit biased, but it's an incredible read. And one of the reasons why it's so fascinating, and this is difficult because I don't want to give the plot away, but let me phrase it like this. Near the very beginning of the book, a big event happens. The event is both very humorous, but it also leads one to think, well, the end of the world is coming. In the midst of that really strange situation, the main characters, who are all either in or associated with the community of faith, begin to be enticed. They begin to be enticed by the prospect of certainty. Certainty is always enticing, isn't it? I mean, in the midst of a difficult situation, who doesn't want someone to stand up, preferably a strong and courageous leader, to say, this is what's happening, this is why, and this is where we're going to go from here. And if that person can say, God has done this, this is why God has acted in this way, and this is what God has called us to do in response, well then sign me up. We all like to be certain, and if we are certain that God is on our side, then even better, right? There is a problem with that. You can hear it, right? The temptation of certainty happens in the very first story. Adam and Eve, what were they enticed by? Certainty. If you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then you will become like God, knowing good from evil. Go ahead. You'll have the mind of God. That's the promise the serpent makes to them. Throughout the Bible and throughout human history, we have been enticed by certainty. And I know what happens when I fall into that trap. To be honest, I become prideful, I become arrogant, and maybe worst of all, I become dismissive. And this is why. If I have the mind of God, if I am certain that God's views and my views are one and the same, then if you disagree with me, you're not really disagreeing with me, you are disagreeing with God, which means I don't even need to listen to you. You see how that becomes a problem, right? Well, one of the beauties of this book is that the author does, in a pretty sly way, exposes this. Exposes how pride and arrogance, all centered around certainty, are such a bad and painful thing. Instead, I was reminded once again that the proper attitude for a Christian is not certainty. We're certain of God's love, but we're not certain of the mind of God. We know that God's ways are not always our ways, which is why we are humble, or that is what we strive to be. Because if we're humble, then when we encounter others who are different from us, whose opinions may be exactly the opposite of what we believe or think to be true, then in the very least we're able to listen to them. And what is better, to look for God in our neighbor. Again, humility rather than pride, humility rather than certainty is the attitude for God's people. A lesson I needed to be reminded of, and frankly, a lesson I always need to be reminded of.